A new pharaoh arises, and he doesn't remember Joseph. He enslaves the people because they're becoming too numerous and becoming a threat. So he puts them to work and embitters their lives, building store cities of Pithom and Ramses, and makes them create bricks out of mud and straw.
It was intriguing to see this type of construction in different parts of Egypt. Were any of these bricks molded by the hands of Israelite slaves? However, Mansour was quick to remind me that these types of mud bricks are present throughout Egypt's history and don't prove any connection to the Israelites. In his search for evidence that fits the idea of Israelite slavery, Professor James Hoffmeyer focuses on the first half of the New Kingdom because he favors a Ramesses Exodus date. There he finds a very interesting set of evidence. It states in the biblical story that the Hebrews were supposed to make bricks from mud and straw. Is there any evidence of that?
We have two lines of evidence that this practice referred to in Exodus chapter 1 and Exodus chapter 5 really was the sort of thing going on. We have the depiction in the tomb of Rechmireh. He was a vizier or prime minister under Thutmose III in the 15th century. And there we can see POWs, both Semites from Canaan and Syria, working alongside prisoners of war from Nubia, black Africans. And there they are making bricks, overseen by Egyptian taskmasters with sticks. And so it's very clear that this was the treatment of prisoners of war. And we see these foreigners making bricks in southern Egypt for a building project at Karnak Temple. And I'm sure that picture could be replicated in other parts of Egypt, especially in the north. Secondly, we also have, from the same time period, the 15th century, the 18th dynasty, we also have pictures of agricultural work, especially work in the vineyards, picking grapes, stomping on grapes to make juice and wine. Here again, we find the same prisoners of war engaged in agriculture. Exodus 1:14 actually says they worked in brick and mortar and agriculture. So interestingly, the very two areas the Bible says the Israelites were forced to work in, agriculture and construction work, is the very two places we see this sort of work going on in private tombs in Egypt in the 15th century BC.
Now, were all these prisoners of war, could these have been people such as the Bible states that were actually there that became suspicious and then were forced into labor?
In the case of the tomb of Rechmireh, tomb 100 in the Theban necropolis, it actually tells us they were hawked, they were plundered, they were prisoners brought back from the king's campaigns. Mm-hmm. So, and these happen to be in the south in Luxor. The problem is we don't have corresponding tombs for what was going on in the Delta, where the Hebrews were. So we lack that kind of evidence. Also during the 15th century BC, we have the beginnings of the deportations of prisoners of war from the wars of the pharaohs Thutmose I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II. These are bringing prisoners of war both from Syria and Canaan as well as from Nubia to the south. All these prisoners of war are flooding into Egypt and are being pressed into hard labor for the state. So we have both the old Semitic population, second, third generation of whom are still around in the 15th, 14th, 13th century, and then you have the new population of Semites who were brought in as POWs from the campaigns of the Egyptian pharaohs. So there was a significant network of foreign people living in Egypt during the New Kingdom.
While this is good evidence for the presence of Semitic slaves doing the right types of work, prisoners of war do not match the Bible's account of the early Israelites. Meanwhile, David Rowe pointed to a different set of evidence that fits the pattern found in Egypt's Middle Kingdom, beginning with finds from Avaris. Well, what happened next? What does the archaeological record show?
What we then see is that the graves of these people, we begin to see in the bones deterioration in the quality of life. We see Harris lines in the bones, which indicate famine, shortage of food and nutrients. These people suddenly have become impoverished. Not only that, but we start to see larger houses, which seem to be Egyptian in design, and then smaller houses attached to them, which seem to be servants' houses. And this is what we see for the very first time. And we even find papyri with lists of slaves with Semitic names on them at this period as well.
Tell me more about the bones.
If we look at the cemetery population, that's the dead, if you like, and that's the evidence we have of the living, is the dead. And we look at their graves, we find something very interesting happens. At the beginning, these people seem to prosper. The quality of their lives is very good. But all of a sudden, at some point in the story, we see a degeneration. We see a degeneration in the burials and the actual graves themselves. The investigation of the anthropological data has shown us that we are dealing with people who lived probably to about 32 to 34 years of age and then died. That's the typical life expectancy of the time. So we're not talking about a people who prospered and went on to live into their 50s and 60s, as you might expect. These people had really tough lives. So how do we explain that? What is the mechanism that we would understand why these people only lived to such a short age? And the obvious answer is slavery.
So you're saying that this group that came in that was prosperous then fell on hard times?
Yeah. We've got a situation of prosperity followed by a lack of prosperity and a shortage of life. So it seems very clear that these Asiatic peoples, these people have come from the north, speaking a Semitic language, who first of all prospered in this region, have suddenly been enslaved.
Is there any physical evidence that there was slavery of Hebrew-type people in Egypt?
There's one particular document which is quite amazing. It's called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And this actually is a list of domestic servants from one estate.
We have maybe up to 100 people listed as slaves in Egypt. When we look at those names, 70% of them are Semitic names. And you can literally pick up Israelite names in there. Menachem, Issachar, and Asher, the names of two other tribes of Israel. Shiphrah, one of the Hebrew midwives in the Exodus story, a name that appears in this document. These are Hebrew Israelite slaves, and they're in a papyrus from the 13th dynasty, not from the 19th dynasty, not from the time of Ramesses II in the New Kingdom, but from the 13th dynasty, the Middle Kingdom.
What does this mean to you? What does it say?
This is real evidence for the time when the Israelites were in Egypt as slaves. It's when you get a text, suddenly you've got history. Archaeology, you have to interpret. When you have a text, this is something very different.
David, can you put a specific date on the Brooklyn Papyrus?
The Brooklyn Papyrus is dated to one reign. The name of the king appears on it, and the king is called Sobekotep III. Now, he's the first king of a mini dynasty in the 13th dynasty, where you have maybe 4 or 5 very powerful rulers coming to the fore, a family of strong pharaohs. And this could be the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, the one who enslaved the Israelites, because it comes maybe 3 or 4 generations after the Middle Kingdom, when Joseph arrives in Egypt. We suddenly find this strong pharaoh, Sobekotep III, and we have this list of slaves with Israelite names.
David, the thing that I'm puzzled by is why so many Egyptologists ignore the Brooklyn Papyrus.
Well, this is the old problem again about time, isn't it? You have a situation here where, although everybody recognizes that this list is a list of Semitic slaves, and everybody recognizes that the names appearing in here are also Israelite names, these can't be the Israelites, because it's the wrong time period. The Israelites are much later in history. So these people we're seeing here in this Brooklyn Papyrus in the time of Sobekotep III cannot be the Israelites. All this evidence that we're finding in Avaris, this city in Goshen in the Eastern Delta, points us to the period when the Israelites were in Egypt, and that is the period we call the Middle Bronze Age. Most Egyptologists put the period of the slavery in the New Kingdom, in the 19th dynasty, and here we are in the 13th dynasty. So the things don't match.
So that's why they disregard it.
So they put it to one side and say it's another coincidence.